report, which is the primary document received in your board packet tonight. The responsibility for all of that data rests with district management. We come out and perform our audit to provide an opinion that goes to the front of that document as to whether it fairly presents the district's financial position and the results for the year-end audit. As part of that audit, because you report in accordance with government accounting standards, you'll find a separately issued report on governmental accounting standards, internal controls, and compliance. We also audit to an audit guide that's put out by the state auditor's office and give an opinion as to your compliance with Minnesota state laws and regulations. Something a little different this year. Normally, this is where I start talking about your single audit. The district earns, and did again this year, more than $750,000 in federal awards, which requires you to have a separate single audit of those expenditures. It's a separate compliance audit. We're not issuing that tonight because we can't. Basically what's going on, we've done most of the work for it, but part of the guidance that we have to use for that audit, the uniform guidance, each year there is a compliance supplement that all of the grantor agencies update and put out, and that's part of what we have to use as an audit guide. The 2025 compliance supplement has not been issued by the federal government yet. There was a draft that's been out since the end of August, and I'm not exactly sure what the holdup is. I know at one point it kind of became the government shutdown because it wasn't being put out, but until we have that guidance final, we can't be sure that we did everything that they're going to require. So we're not allowed to issue that separate single audit until that's out there. The state recognizes pretty early on, and the MDE put guidance out there that they're going to allow the deadline for that to go from the December 31st deadline for your financial report to March 31st, which is the federal deadline. So March 31st, 2026, you should see that report issued by then, assuming that guidance is issued, but right now we can't do it. As far as the audit itself, once again this year, it was a very good audit process. The district records were in good shape. Everything was reconciled. The records that we audit were prepared and ready to go. We did issue an unmodified opinion on your financial statements again this year. That's basically the highest opinion that we can give. There is in the opinion at the front of your document once again this year, and this is, shoot, I don't know, probably 4 out of the last 5 years, we make reference to a change in accounting principles that you had to implement this year. For 2025, it was GASB statement number 101, which is new guidance on accounting for compensated absences. So this encompasses all of your employee compensated absences, so sick leave, PTO, vacation, everything. It didn't change a ton. The big change here was with regard to sick leave. In the past, you only had to report a long-term sick leave liability based on what you thought you would pay out for employees at the end of their employment as a termination benefit. Now, this is having you treat that like all of your other vacation and all of your other benefits, where they're also having you accrue based on what you think you're going to pay out over the course of employment for all your employees. So what's accrued at the end of June 30, 25 for all of your employees is now being reported as a long-term liability. This doesn't affect your fund-based statements. It's only going to be on your entity-wide financial statements, but essentially that implementation of this new guidance caused a restatement of your beginning net position of just under $18 million. So that estimated liability changed by about $18 million, recognizing all of those sick leave benefits for your employees. From an internal control and compliance standpoint, as far as your financial statement audit was concerned, we had no internal control weaknesses to report, nor did we find any instances of non-compliance during our testing. As I mentioned, we also issue a report letter on your compliance with Minnesota laws and regulations. There was one thing to report there. This was basically timing of payment of claims. One of the claims that we selected for testing was not paid within 35 days of the receipt of goods or services or the invoice for goods or services, which is the statutory requirement. This is by far the most common finding that we see. And what happened here is what typically causes this. The invoice, you're a fairly large district. Some of these invoices are received out at different buildings, and there was a delay in getting that invoice over to the business office to pay. Once it got to the business office, it did get paid timely, but that delay in getting the approved invoice over to the business office in the first place caused it to be longer than 35 days. From a compliance standpoint, that covers all of the opinions that we issue, since we don't have the single audit to talk about before I move along to some of the financial information for the year. Questions on anything I've talked about so far?
You had said the NW, what was that statement? That we wouldn't see something on, you mentioned the abbreviation of NW something statement.
Oh, entity-wide, I'm sorry.
Oh, what was it?
The entity-wide or government-wide statements.
Oh, okay.
Are you talking about the adjustment for compensated absences?
Yep.
Yeah, so what I'm saying is that will not change how that liability hits your general fund. But in your financial statements, there's another layer of reporting that's full accrual. So all of your long-term liabilities, long-term assets are in that statement. So this is kind of like your pension liability, your other post-employment benefits liability. We also report your benefits, or your compensated absence of benefits liability in there, and that's won't change how anything gets accounted for in your funds. It's just that upper level of reporting. That makes sense. Okay. And I do actually, the last slide in here might clarify that for you a little bit as I go through. Any other questions? I'm going to move along. I'll start kind of on the fund level, and we'll talk about your general fund financial position. This is your primary operating fund. This graph shows kind of a history of your financial position over the last 10 fiscal years, and that green line in there, just to give you some context for the size of your operation, that's your annual expenditures. So you've gone from about $140 million budget in your general fund to $240 million over the last decade. At the end of 2025, you had about $92 million in total cash in your general fund. That's down about $6.5 million from the year before. Your total fund balances were about $72.3 million. That was down about $8.8 million from the year before. It was quite a bit over your budget, but that's because of the way you budget. You've got a lot of fund balance assignments that you amend your budget mid-year to kind of re-budget those building carryovers and things like that. So we'll get into that a little more as I talk more specifically about the revenues and expenditures. This table shows how your general fund financial position, your fund balances are reported into kind of the different components. The top line there, non-spendable fund balances, which were about $1.6 million at the end of the year. This basically represents your prepaid expenditures and a little bit of inventory that you carry in the general fund. And essentially, it's still an asset to you going forward, but it's not cash. You can't spend it for something else. So it gets reported in that separate category of fund balance. Restricted fund balances, which make up about $12.5 million of your total fund balance. These are basically the state mandated spending restrictions. There's some strings on some of the various pots of money that you get. At the end of the year, that $12.4 million was down just a bit from $12.6 million the year before in restricted fund balances. Just to give you a little bit of an idea how that breaks down, you've got a little over $1.5 million in restrictions for student activities and scholarships. So these are really dollars that you don't spend for typical general fund expenditures. They belong to your student organizations and a small scholarship fund that you've had. You've got about $5.5 million that's restricted for operating capital. The next largest one is about $4.4 million for staff development. And you've got a little bit under $1 million in various other state spending mandated restrictions. Then the unrestricted portion you see there, 58 million, this is essentially what you control at a local level. This is actually split down into 3 more categories. There's a small portion of that that's called committed fund balance. This was committed by board action and would have to be changed by board action if you were to uncommit that or spent. You've got about 1.4 million in committed fund balances, and that's basically for future retirement benefits. The biggest piece of this is assigned fund balances. You've got about $39 million in fund balance assignments, and this is essentially things you've internally earmarked. It doesn't have to be by board resolution. Your finance team does some of this with you. Of that $39 million, you've got just under $15 million in site carryovers, and this is what I was talking about with your budget. You budget your expected expenditures every year, and then this site carryover, and you've got another $12.5 million for curriculum and technology. You add those back to your budget with your mid-year budget amendments, and then anything that doesn't get spent kind of goes back into these assigned buckets here. You also have about $7.5 million this year that's assigned for your 2026 budget. Anytime you adopt a budget for the next year where you are planning to spend fund balance down, that becomes an ad hoc assigned fund balance, so that's shown in that bucket as well. You've got about $4 million for facilities improvements and about $150,000 for strategic planning. Then the last piece of this, which has no external or internal earmarks, you can spend for anything, as your unassigned fund balance, and that represented about $17.8 million at year end. You've got a fund balance policy that assigned fund balance should be a minimum of 5% of your annual budget expenditures. That $17.8 million represents about 6.5% of your budget expenditures based on your final budget for 2025. One of the things that drives a good portion of your funding is the number of students that you serve each year. This graph shows that in terms of average daily membership, which are the blue bars. That's kind of the raw number of students that you had. And then the pupil units that generates when there's grade weightings that get applied to those numbers. And that pupil unit number is what goes into your general education formula and a number of your other funding formulas to drive what you get in aid year to year. So for 2025, you had an average daily membership of about 14,250. Again, with the grade weightings applied, that worked out to just over 15,500 pupil units. That was an increase of close to 200 pupil units from the year before, about a 1.3% increase. You've kind of been on a nice steady growth pattern the last 3 years. Your pupil units have grown about 1.6%, 1.3%, 1.3%. So you've been kind of back on a steady growth. You had a little bit of a hiccup back in the COVID years in 21 and 22, but you've kind of gotten back to where you were before that, where you're slowly growing each year. So general fund revenues for the year were about $228 million. You were over budget by about $2 million, which represents a little less than 1%. Almost all of that budget variance was in the state aid category, which is where you get most of your revenue. State aids were about $2.3 million over budget, and kind of the big driver there is your students came in a little stronger, your enrollment, than the projection you used there. So that was a lot of it. And you also used some of your special education aid for tuition this year, which increased both your state special education revenue and expenditures for special ed tuition. Revenue went up about 4%, roughly $8.5 million from the year before. About $2.4 million of that was operating referendum increase to your property tax levy. Your state aids actually went up by $9.5 million. Again, a lot of that was general education aid. You got a 2% increase on the formula, plus you had about a 1.3% increase in pupil units, and also special education. Those are kind of the two biggest pots of aid that you get. There were also several smaller new grants this year, some literacy aid, new programs. Your federal revenue actually went down by about $1.2 million. This is kind of spending the tail of some of those COVID grants that you've been spending down over several years. Those are pretty much done at the end of 2024, so that you kind of saw that federal aid going down the last few years. And then your other revenues, which kind of are all the catch-all for investment earnings, admissions, fees, donations. That was down by about $2 million compared to the year before also. About 1.2 of that was less in investment earnings. And then also in 2024, you received a fairly sizable E-rate reimbursement, sorry, easy for me to say. That was a non-recurring item that kind of made most of that difference. On the expenditure side, you spent just under $237 million in the general fund. As I mentioned, that was quite a bit under. This is where your budget variance really came in. That was about $36 million under your final budget. But your initial budget was about $220,000. You increased that to $272.6 million in your final budget, and most of that was pulling in those assigned fund balances for carryovers and such that you reassign and then put back in the carryover if it's not spent year to year. Your variance salaries and benefits were about $3.7 million under budget. And this was mainly due to open positions. You're still having a little bit of trouble filling all of your budgeted positions with kind of a challenging labor market. Purchase services were about $5 million under budget. I think you're pretty conservative. You had a very large increase in transportation costs, and you were pretty conservative with budgeting for that, so you came in a little under there, and also some of the staff development that you didn't spend that went back into your staff development restricted fund balance were the main variances there. And then between supplies and capital expenditures, you're about $27 million under budget. And this is basically your building site carryovers and to a smaller extent, the timing of some of the capital projects that you run in the general fund. Expenditures were about $32 million higher than the last year, about a 15.5% increase. A lot of that was driven by serving more students. Your salaries and benefits in the instructional areas, regular instruction, special education instruction, both went up. Contracted services also went up. Again, transportation was kind of the big driver there. Also, to a lesser extent, special education purchase services were up. And then capital and projects were a little bit higher than last year also. I'll move on to some of your other funds. These are much smaller but still important funds. The two graphs here show a history of your fund balance at the end of the year in your food service special revenue fund and your community service special revenue fund. Just for context, instead of $240 million in expenditures, these funds, you spend about $10 million in the food service fund this year and about $11 million in the community service fund. The food service fund, your fund balance went up by about $900,000. Most of that was due to cost savings. Your food and purchase service costs were about $2 million under budget in that fund. So you ended the year with about $6.75 million fund balance in the food service fund. Your community service fund, you took in revenue of about $10.7 million and spent about $11 million in that fund. You were about $285,000 over budget on the expenditure side, mainly in salaries. So your fund balance did go down by about $368,000 to an ending fund balance of about $500,000 in that fund. I'll briefly just mention a couple of other funds that I don't have pictures of. These kind of run itself based on your bond issues. You've got a capital project fund that you've been using for a lot of facility maintenance, both through bonding and through levy. You had about $1.1 million in interest revenue in that fund, and you issued bonds of about $34 million, including premium on those bonds in 2025. You completed projects worth about $17.3 million. So your fund balance in this fund went up by close to $18 million during the year. You've got projects obviously lined up to spend those fund proceeds or the bond proceeds down. Of that $40 million $40 million ending fund balance. About 28 of that is long-term facilities maintenance restricted, so that's mainly the bond issues that you just sold this year. And you got another 12 and a half that's restricted for capital projects, but not limited to the LTFM projects. And then you also have a debt service fund. Again, all the levies that you collect in here are basically approved each time you issue bonds with the bond documents. So you had revenues of about $24.5 million and debt service of about $24 million, which included retiring about $15 million of principal in your outstanding bonds. And at the end of the year, you have about $6 million for future debt service. And the last slide I want to share with you, and hopefully this will help clarify what I was talking about with the compensated absences. So the very first two financial schedules in your overall statement, the first two financial statements in here are what we refer to as your entity-wide or district-wide financial statements. So what these do is we take all this fund information that we talked about, which doesn't report long-term capital assets, doesn't report long-term bonds, doesn't report these long-term employee benefits. This converts that information to a full accrual basis, so it brings all of that in and it puts all the funds together in a single presentation. So this kind of gives you a full accrual or a longer-term perspective of your financial position that includes all those long-term assets and liabilities. The top there, it kind of walks you through how you get from your total fund balances of about $126 million. You can see you've got capital assets of about $425 million at the end of the year, outstanding debt mainly related to acquiring or building those capital assets of about $300 million. And then those last three things are mainly some of those long-term employee benefits that we talked about, your other post-employment benefits, your pension liabilities, and a lot of that $98 million is your proportionate share of two statewide plans, PERA and TRA. You don't really have any control over those other than how many employees you have. All of the funding for that, your contribution rates, their investing decisions, the benefits are all set at a statewide level, but every local government that participates in those plans has to report your share of any underfunding at the end of the year in your entity-wide statements. So that's based on what you're contributing for your employees as a percentage of what gets contributed statewide to those plans. They allocate out the plan underfunding, and that's at $98 million is makes up most of that. You also do have a small pension plan that's district-specific in there. And then those other adjustments, which you can see went quite a bit different this year. That's where that change in compensated absences comes through. So that $17.8 million restatement of compensated absences, that change in that position is coming through on that other adjustment sign on top. And down below, you can see the total net position actually was a positive change of a little over $5 million for the year. Of the different components that gets reported in, your net investment in capital assets is basically those capital assets up above offset by any of that debt that's outstanding. So that went up by about $24.5 million. A lot of that is due to the relationship of how quickly you depreciate the assets versus how quickly you're paying back the bonds. But also when you levy, like a long-term facilities maintenance levy, you're adding capital assets without having to issue additional debt. That also drives that number up faster. That restricted net position you see there of about $33 million, that went up a couple million from the year before. That is primarily all of those restricted fund balances that we talked about going through the funds, and that does include like anything that's in a food service fund, anything that's in a community service fund, just by the nature of being in those funds and you can't spend them for something else, those all fall down to that restricted net position line. And then the final element of that is your unrestricted net position. You see the deficit there of about $49 million. That is essentially your general fund, unrestricted fund balances offset by all of those long-term employee benefit liabilities that aren't funded by anything. You do have an OPEB trust that helps fund your OPEB liability, but those pension liabilities and compensated absences aren't pre-funded in any way. So that's why you're seeing that deficit there, and that change, that $21 million increase in that negative element there is primarily due to the fact that you had to change in accounting for your compensated absences. Also had a little bit to do with the shift in your general fund. Your total fund balance went up, but your unrestricted fund balances in that fund were lower than they were last year. So that's typically what I've covered in past meetings. Questions on any of that? I know I threw a lot of numbers at you there. Did that clarify your question on how the compensated absences are coming through?
I guess it just gets checked later and
Well-
sounds like something newer too.
Yeah, it is, and the only thing I wanted to make clear is that it only impacts this level of reporting, which isn't your general fund, right? So your general fund budget and how you spend and how you pay those didn't change. It's only in this long-term perspective financial statement. It changes how that liability gets measured. It just brought in some things that you weren't reporting before. Okay?
So it comes across as just an accrual
Right.
that you're building up?
Right, it's, basically all of these, your OPEB liability, your pension liability, your compensated absence liabilities, these are all things that basically promises to pay future benefits to your employees. You don't record those in your general fund until they're actually due and payable, till either someone takes a vacation day or somebody retires, then they become an expense in your general fund. But that's kind of a estimate of what those liabilities for the future are.
So it's just a statement of liability on the balance sheet, basically, is what it is.
Correct.
That makes sense.
Any questions?
I have some questions. I just want to make sure I understand what you said. That was a lot of numbers, right? So
Absolutely.
I want to make sure I understand our financial situation. I've been going over this for days, and that was very helpful. Thank you.
Good.
So if I understand right, our original projected revenue budget was about 220 million. Our expenditures were 236 million. So we actually spent 16 million more than originally projected. Sorry, I'll start over. You don't have to, all these numbers are in your report. I'm just making sure I understand them, so don't worry about the numbers. So basically, what I'm saying is, our original budget had around $220 million in it. Our expenditures, according to Table 4, are at $236 million. So from our original budget, we spent $16 million more. But what happened was the revised budget, as you explained, is mid-year March this board approved was the carryover money. So at the time, we had said 46 million was being carried over, but the report had slightly more, so we carried over 52 million. So that's budget carryovers, right? So now that inflates that budget so that now we're coming in under budget, because you said we came under budget. But my concern is that doesn't really reflect our situation, because that money can't be spent. So the reason we're coming in under budget in that statement is because we had this large carryover and we didn't spend it all. But that's assigned or committed money, and we couldn't do anything with the assigned, perhaps the committed. Is that all correct?
Assigned is entirely internal. I mean, that's something you've earmarked internally, and a big chunk of that carryover is actually site carryovers, where I believe the control of whether they spend that or not in a given year is at your building sites. And I would say this is also a little bit of that. I mean, a percentage of that increase also was because of increased revenues, because you had some larger enrollment. But yeah, a lot of that was the carryovers that you pull in each year.
Gotcha. So a follow-up question then. So when I'm looking at it, what I saw in Table 5 is if we're not looking at all the carryover, we're just looking at the bottom line. So I'm looking at revenue and expenditures. We took in 228 million, we spent 236 million, which is an 8.7 million deficit. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay, and so that's slightly better. We are expecting during the review, if I remember, it was 11 million. And then the last question is, and I'll turn the mic over. So you mentioned that our unassigned fund balance is at 6.5% as of 2025.
Yes, as of June 30th.
That includes all money taken in, all money going out. That's 6%, 6.5% unrestricted fund balance is how we ended 2025.
Yes, so if, this is the table that kind of shows the breakdown. So unrestricted includes your assignments, that little bit of committed you have, plus that unassigned. So like I said, all of this is essentially under local control. The committed piece has to be changed based on board action. The assignments, I think you kind of do with your, between the board and your management each year. And then that unassigned piece, which is just under 18 million of that 58, that's what your policy is based on. That's where that 6.5% comes from. If you take all of those unrestricted pieces, you're at about 24.5% of your budget.
And that's down from 32.6.
Yes.
So all three buckets went down.
Yes.
Okay. Perfect. I understand. Thank you.
Sure.
Any other questions?
I have one more question then if no one else wants to. On the audit process, so the year closes out on June 30th, the fiscal year, and then the administration gives the final numbers to you in August or September?
Yes, we start the process, I think our first week was, I can't remember if it was late August or September of this year, but we have a couple of different weeks where we're out. So the process is getting a lot different than it used to be because of all the liabilities that get dumped into that last screen I showed you. So you calculate all of your receivables for federal grants, for state grants, and close the books, and that's all kind of wrapping up towards the end of September. Those fund numbers should be getting pretty good. But you also have to work with actuaries to calculate your estimated OPEB and pension plan draws. This new compensated absence, I'm sure if you wanted to have Joe walk you through the spreadsheet for calculating that, that's massive. They keep adding all of these things. Kind of the point of that other layer of reporting was to try and make a government's financial statements more comparable to a for-profit company. So they're bringing in all of these liabilities. So all of these governmental accounting standards board changes that you've been seeing kind of year after year after year if you've been on the board are things that they're doing to try and kind of square up with the way that statement works compared to the way a for-profit company would work. So you've had changes in leases, you've had changes in accounting for subscriptions for technology, you've had changes in capital assets where they're making you now account for groups of assets even if they're below your threshold. They're just some of the changes that have happened, and it unfortunately keeps pushing the timeline to truly get the entity-wide statements done back, because it's more things that you have to send off the actuary to, like for your OPEB, for example, we have to come out and audit your trust assets and your cash and make sure that's right, and the district has to go through and determine, because you're self-insured, what you paid there, to determine what you can draw out of your trust and decide if you want to draw out of your trust. Then all that information goes off to your actuary, and then they send a report back, and then we have to audit that. And that's just one example of the things that have become more complex in recent years. So from a fund standpoint, I'd say most of your information is pretty good by, for a district this size, by the end of September would be pretty darn good.
Thank you.
Sure.
So I suppose what you're trying to communicate is driving a little bit more transparency in the financial statements?
Pardon?
You're driving probably more transparency, with putting the liabilities out there?
Yes. And these have always been liabilities, and part of the goal of trying to present full accrual was to put some estimate out there of what those look like.
Sure. Accruals are guesstimates.
Yes.
So, well, any other questions? Thank you so much for the presentation. We really appreciate it.
Thank
And all
you.
the work. I know it's a ton of work. Thank you, Mr. Reagan.
Joe and his team, they do a great job.
Joe and teams, so thank you. Moving on, we're going to go to the budget reduction. And if you recall that at the October 27th board work session, we had some budget scenarios that we looked at, and we're going to review those now. So, Superintendent Olmos?
Yeah, they're linked in your packet there, so you have it. It's the same document that you saw at the October work session. I think the idea here was to come back and to have some more discussion and potential action on one of these items. I think what we would be asking of the board tonight is to try to determine which scenario the board feels the most comfortable with. Happy to make a recommendation on that if you so choose. And then we would go work on the preliminary budget for next year with that target in mind. Additionally, as we work on that budget, we would be coming back to you sometime after the first of the year to say, here's the impact, what this could look like with these reductions in mind. And so just as a reminder from our discussions in October that all of these scenarios in orange could include a reduction in fund balance up to $3 million or so. And so that's why we have it broken out with two different numbers on each scenario. And again, the orange, or whatever color that is, orange, would be if we applied that $3 million to each scenario. So that's the document in front of you, and with that, we'll open it up for discussion.
Comments?
Okay, thank you. So the audit was very helpful because it gave me all the information I've been wanting to have for the last few months. So I guess now I'm really confused on these scenarios. So I have a whole bunch of questions, but I want to start just by having you guys tell me. So in this, because we just heard our starting fund balance is 6.5%, and all of these assume 8%. And we're saying that we might have to spend, we're going to spend down money and arrive at 8%. So you can see where that totally bewilders me. So when you're building these scenarios, what is the starting point for the fund balance that you're starting with on these scenarios?
I can see why that's confusing. I'm trying to come up with how do I give you that answer, though, right off the top of my head. The difference between unassigned fund balance and committed fund balance, I think, is maybe where that answer lies. So we'd have to probably dig a little bit more for you and say, here's what that means for committed, if more of that money is going to go into the unassigned fund balance.
Okay, so all the unrestricted monies, you're thinking we might move some of the unrestricted from assigned to committed over to unrestricted?
Unassigned fund balance, yep.
And do we know how much would have to be moved? I mean, we're at 6.5 right now, right?
Yeah, I don't know off the top of my head how much that would have to be, yep.
We're at 8% as a starting point with unassigned, correct?
Correct, with just the unassigned portion, correct.
So we're still at 8% fund
Yeah.
balance as a starting point
Yeah.
for unassigned.
You just said 6.5 unassigned.
Okay, and so you're gonna have to break it down and explain the different categories.
Yeah, we might have to,
It's complicated,
yeah,
and I can't explain it well because I won't heard it.
yeah. We might have to spend some more time explaining that to you in the future.
So you got to talk about the different areas, unassigned, committed, and how it's all compiled together.
Yeah. What's hard about tonight is they're, as he said, pulling it all together to make us look like a business. And when we break it out, you get those funds separately, but it depends where we put those monies in assigned or unassigned. But we can move that number to make that be 8% based on what's in the assigned categories, should the board choose.
Because we don't run this district on accrual basis, but that's what he's doing in his business
Correct.
model. So he is taking all of our numbers, the way that we run them, the way we do all of our basis, changing the whole model to accrual basis to show what he needs to. But they're not linked directly together. It's very complicated to see them do that and to understand it. It's,
I get that, but, so I understand all that, but when we talk and we get a report from the board, and I always ask, what's the deficit, what are the numbers, and we're told we're gonna stay within our 8% unassigned balance. We're saying then the proper terminology should be what's our unrestricted balance, because we have an unassigned balance, and we haven't moved money between buckets, right? Because the assigned and committed, they're committed to things, right? That's why we had that 52 million that came over in March that inflated the budget. That was most of that money. We spent some of it on land. It was unused building funding. I can't remember what the 3 categories were, but they're assigned to be used. So then the board would have to take action to unassign it, or to assign it to something else. So I guess maybe this whole time I've been assuming that when we said unassigned, we were talking about the literal unassigned fund balance, as is what it is. But we're saying that so what the answer is we're at 6.5% unassigned now, but we're gonna move money over from one of the other buckets into the unassigned category in excess of 3 million, whatever it takes that we'll be able to spend down. We're saying 3 million, and then we'll land it still within 8% or over. That's
So I think you have to decide which category you want to look at, because you can't cross that audit that was done with our numbers. They're completely separate columns. So to use that information and then pull it across, it's not going to work that way.
Well, and that's exactly why when we make decisions like this, we need to know more than just we're gonna preserve 8% fund balance. I would like to know where we sit with the deficit right now in the spending, and, because it seems to me the most simple, am I talking loud enough so people can hear? It seems to me the information the board needs is where we sit on the deficit right now, so we can look at what our options are. How much do we need to cut, or how much do we need to transfer from committed monies? What are those monies committed to that we're taking away from to move them to unassigned? We should have some of this information so we have the big picture, other than just saying we're gonna meet that 8% unassigned. Because what I heard also today wasn't just we're at 6.5 right now. It was that we have an 8.8 million deficit. That was June. That was before we just assigned our contracts. So I have no idea what the number is now versus revenues. So just a general picture of our financial situation would really help me with these.
Yeah, I don't think you're ever going to get that specific. This is next year's projection of a budget, and he just closed out last year. So if you can tell me, if we can predict what's going to happen in this budget specifically, right down to, this standard deviation, we can get way more accurate in those numbers. So what this is about, next year's budget projection, and when we run our math on projection, if you look at these scenarios, it's anywhere from $3 to $6.5 million, right? And what we're saying is scenario 1 might mean that there's more cuts in the future. Scenario 3 tells us that's probably going to be the most conservative estimate to try to avoid cuts in the future. And number 2 is somewhere in between. So I think what's hard about what you're asking for is that you're talking about 3 fiscal years all at the same time, and we're projecting, starting in October for a budget that starts in July. I think that's what's really difficult about trying to get down to that actual number.
So, I'm not asking for specifics. I mean, you have projections. You have a projection, a monthly projection, I would guess. So we should know right now where the deficit is, right? Like, do we not have a monthly projection of this current fiscal year where we sit?
We don't run monthly projections in a district this size. That would be very difficult to do. You do get a chance to revise the budget when we look at early spring, because then we go and do exactly what Joe and John and his team have been doing, and we go and reconcile where the accounts are, where the spending is versus revenue, and then we project the rest of the short year in a revised budget, which gives us a much better example of where we start next fiscal year. So we don't have a monthly, like, here's where we stand. Do we watch it based on what our budgets are in those items? Oh, for sure we do. So if there's a budget that's come out way ahead or way under, we're watching those budgets specifically, but we don't go tie out the entire district every month.
If I look at the May 28th budget, I was looking at the fund balance, and there was roughly on the budget for this fiscal year, it's running 15% is the budgeted number, but I suppose that fluctuates up and down throughout the year, but that's the target. Any other comments?
So when I look at this sheet and I look at the way the district does its accounting, not accrual-based, I would say we continue to work off of these numbers and what we budget and see. And I understand, again, when we get an audit, it gets confusing because they change the way we record, account for stuff, et cetera. I look at scenario 2 on this, and to me, scenario 2 is a reasonable reduction. Gonna take 4 to 5.5 million, and the 1.2 is going to reduce the fund balance down. Based on all the unknowns, sitting here in November, not knowing where the legislator's at, not knowing how many students, not knowing so many factors, this allows our team to work through a budget, make reasonable reductions. It preserves our 8% fund balance as a board and allows us not to make dramatic cuts to the system that may not be needed, because next September, if we have another 200 to 300 more students, we're gonna need educators and people for them. So when I look at scenario 2, it also helps us set up for the future. Does that mean that in 27, 28, there won't be reductions? No, but I think we continue to look at them. I do not see a cliff here that we need to worry about right now.
If you don't have the projections, how do you know that scenario number 2 is gonna be enough? If we can't even project what the deficit might be, we don't have a projected revenue, we don't have a projected deficit because it's too far in the future, how do we know that this is gonna be sufficient?
Okay, so we do have that. We do have projected revenue. We just have to decide, what do you want to use? Do you want to use current students today, October? Do you want to add 200 students to it? So we have to give that direction. Also, we have our expenditures.
I guess I keep asking for the same thing. So if we have it, I'd like to see what the actual projected revenue is, what the projected deficit is, because we should have that. Even if it's a guess, we're not operating in the dark here. These numbers came from something. We need the 4.5 and the numbers for scenario 2 and scenario 3 came from somewhere. They're not just total guesses, right? So I guess that's what I'm trying to understand more of. And I'm sorry they're late questions. Until we got the audit, I was just operating in the dark a little bit, so.
When we make these projections, we do take a look at revenue and expenditures. We have that. This board typically hasn't gotten to that level of detail, right? So when we bring this to you, we're looking way out in multi-year projections to say, what can we see coming up, right? And so when we see between 3 and 6.5 million, that's a pretty good range, but really a small percentage of the budget if you really think about it. So we're saying we're going to have to do something here, so we don't have to do a lot more later. We can get the board some of those numbers and really dive into that if this board wants that level of detail. We brought these scenarios because we thought, if you're choosing a scenario, we'll go build a budget and you will eventually see revenue and expenditures to match these scenarios.
To me, that comes later, because right now, again, what do you want them to use for revenue? Up 200 kids, 300 kids, hold level? That's a big variation in numbers.
And this was part of that new process? Sure. This was part of that new process where we wanted to try to pull these things forward a little bit more, get in front of them, but they haven't built the full budget out. Again, there's so many factors they need to know. So this is the point of giving that direction. So that they can then, to Andy's point, go build out the details of that budget. Forecast in the numbers, forecast in the number of students.
I think one of the things that's hard is we want them to run all the numbers, and then if we don't like something, go back and go back and go back. So Andy, would it be a good understanding if the board were to give direction of a scenario now? It does not mean we're approving a budget. In February, could we see actual numbers based on these reductions put to it? But I think one thing that we have to understand is how many hundreds of hours on each one of these scenarios to run through to the level of detail you're looking for is there. And so if they run it on all of them and then we don't like it. So to me, this is a 100,000-foot view, direction from the board at 100,000. In February, it's maybe a 50,000-foot view, seeing numbers, and then dial down in April one more time. And obviously in May, it's still a variable, because look at from the time we approved it to actual. You know, there were changes then already. So we made an approved budget in the end of May, or I'm sorry, was it June? End of June. End of June, that was still a projection because we didn't know where everything was at. It's hard to nail it down. So I think what we gave direction to staff on, and what I recall is, we want to understand what are some options for reduction, what does it look like, we give that direction, and then we see numbers in February with the scenario reduction we gave, and then the board can have more conversation on it.
So I guess what I'm not looking for hundreds of hours of work here. I'm looking for work that's been done, just so I can better understand it. And I'll stop, because I'm not gonna get it, so I'll stop. But all I'm asking for is projected revenue, whatever the revenue these are based on. I know formulas can change, but we have to deal in reality with the guesstimate that we have right now. And that guesstimate must include some type of revenue and some type of expenditures. I don't need to see every single thing, just two numbers, revenue and expenditures, so I kind of know what we're looking at cutting here, where we get these numbers from. And I guess some of my concern is with the 8% fund balance, because when we've discussed this, that's the number we get, and every time we spend money, we say, we don't hear what it adds to the deficit. Nobody knows what it is right now. We know it was at $8.8 million at the end of June, and we just signed two contracts. Nobody at this table knows what that added to it, or what it is, or what we're trying to make up. So just wait for a second. Because all we hear is the 8% fund balance, which I get we can transfer money, but then maybe we need to be clear in the future saying, look, this isn't unassigned. Unassigned is already down to 6.5. If we want to maintain 8, you're going to have to approve committed money that was committed somewhere else to move it over. That, to me, would give us a more realistic picture, because I have to admit, I don't think it was all my misunderstanding, but when I saw the audit, I was kind of surprised, because I expected us to be well above 8 without having to board action to move funds into another bucket. So that would give me more clarity. If the rest of the board doesn't need it, that's fine. I guess I'll be done.
I guess Andy, we maybe need to look at doing this. I mean, it would be like taking a business and saying, here's a business running cash base and then running accrual base. The numbers are going to be completely different, right? And so that's part of the scenario is we're seeing it in a formula and a format that works for the district and all of that, and an auditor takes it and puts a twist to it. So to say it's 6.5%, it's not completely accurate. So it's hard because, again, looking at it through two different formulas or lenses. But I understand your point. My understanding is all contract negotiations, the board gave direction to maintain an 8% fund balance. So as they're going through contract negotiations, with this reduction in mind, we're still maintaining an 8% fund balance based on the formula and the format we use to budget the school district.
Thank you. I just think it'll be important for the board to know what makes sense for us. If the budget works for the administration, that's great. If the budget that the auditor works with, that it's different for them, and that's what they need. But if we need something different, it is hard to just, if you imagine the audit shows that we're at 8.8 billion general fund deficit, and then the proposed budget scenarios are only addressing 3 to 5.5 billion in reductions. And I get all these different variables, but transportation went up to 39.9% jump in increase, and like the negotiated contracts, like Director Notos was saying, I do think we just need to dial in on that for the future. So I do agree with you.
So I guess maybe the board needs to give direction on how they want to see numbers moving forward, because both formulas are correct. It's just a matter of how you look at it. Again, I'm going to use the example. You take the same business, you run it cash basis versus accrual, your numbers are going to be completely different. It doesn't make one wrong and the other right. It's a different accounting formula. For me, I'm happy to make a motion to approve scenario 2, and then we revisit this in February. We see what it looks like with actual numbers. We'll have more contract negotiations settled, et cetera, and the board can give more input. So, Mr. Chairman, because there's not an action item on here, are you looking to amend the agenda, or are you looking to just make a motion to approve a scenario?
Well, what we're looking for is guidance, because one of the things that we came up with is to get some pre-planning in some budget criteria and priorities out for the subsequent budget that'll come out probably in April of next year. And so I see what the problem is. The auditor did 24, 25. We're in currently 25, 26, and this is 26, 27. There's two accounting methods: accrual, which they use, which a lot of businesses use, probably small businesses use cash. And so in the education world, there's a hybrid that's going on in terms of financial statements, which makes it very difficult to discern. So the budget that we approved back in May projected a 15% fund balance, but it's all on how you accrue the liabilities in the receipts. If you look in the budget report, even he mentioned that their receivables are based upon, we think MDE is going to pay us, so if we think the money's coming next 30 days, you know, we're going to put it as an accrual, you know, as a receivable. And so it's very difficult to understand the accounting. I was pouring through this audit and it's like, whoa. But right now we're talking about what are the priorities for the general fund, and on a high level, 8% fund balance is where we're targeting at. What the deficit is in terms of revenue over expenses, I think that would be a big guesstimate right now to pull that together.
100%.
Yes.
Again, I go back to my journey into the Elk River School District is helping me learn. To take $250 million-ish and be like, where are we at now, is a lot. So what is in place in order to understand that as we do our revised budget, which I'm not even, like I can't even speak right now to when that date actually happens. But as the team works through the audit and gets through like, what did we spend, what's there, what does this look like, who walked in the door, all that stuff, we get to the revised budget, which is later, I think January, February. That's when we have a really good picture, probably on a month or two past, and what we think is going to happen. So part of the ask of the board, in my understanding, is that we want to make some decisions before we get to that point. The struggle in my team's work in that is that that's really hard to create a crystal clear picture till we get to February, because the amount of work that has to go into what that looks like. So yes, this is, right, we take our enrollment numbers, we project what our enrollment's going to be, but it gets clearer as we go through the year, right? What is our carryovers? What are all those things? If you remember, we came to you guys in October. Like, the auditors were there the week after. So it just gets clearer as we go through it. We can ultimately get to what that looks like, but in order to build this in the right way, we need at least direction now, and we'll get you what you need as we go through it.
So Superintendent Olmos, I guess, or Chair Anderson, are you looking for just a head nod, or are we going to make an action item here to give direction so they can continue to build this?
I was hoping for some action item tonight when we used the words determine budget reductions. I think I'm hoping for an action item.
Yeah, we need a motion then based upon this planning. And remember what you said, the revised budget is a 25-26 budget. It's not a 26-27. So you need the revised budget before you can really adequately put together a preliminary budget for that's required by the MDE, but doesn't have all the legislative mandates that may come or may not come in the student head count for that particular year yet. So it's a guesstimate still, if I recall.
It's closer.
It's closer, but it's not perfect.
Yeah, I hate the money guy. Like, I don't really like guess anything. It just gets clearer the further we move through the year. But it's all based on facts. It's all based on what does this look like. It's just, it gets clearer and there's less room for error the further we get into it.
So with that, I would make a motion to accept scenario 2 for the 26-27 budget planning general fund.
Do we have a second? to that motion. We got a second. Any discussion on scenario number 2? If there's no discussion, we'll go for the vote. All those in favor of taking scenario number 2 for the 26-27 budget planning signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All opposed, say nay. Motion carries. So notice the dates. We got fall break coming up, Thanksgiving, 27th through the 28th. Our next meeting will be December 8th. And do we have a motion to adjourn? Do we have a second? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All opposed, say nay. Motion carries.